Donald Trump has posted on his Truth Social site that Israel and Iran have agreed to a ceasefire. The announcement comes hours after Qatar says it successfully intercepted a barrage of Iranian missiles fired on a U.S. military base there. And Tehran says it matched the number of bombs dropped by the U.S. on Iranian nuclear sites over the weekend. Qatari authorities say there were no casualties in the attack.
Iran released this video footage purporting to show the retaliatory rockets launched towards Qatar. And this message from a military spokesman to the White House.
The Islamic Republic of Iran, relying on Almighty God and the steadfast support of its devout and proud people, will not leave any act of aggression against its territorial integrity, sovereignty or national security unanswered, under any circumstances.
There are some 40,000 US troops stationed throughout the region. The military bases were widely considered prime targets for Iranian retaliation. After the US entered the war between Israel and Iran on the weekend by attacking 3 of Iran's nuclear sites, including dropping so-called bunker buster bombs on the Fordo nuclear facility located deep inside a mountain. Donald Trump posted to his Truth Social site calling the strikes on Qatar a very weak response, but he also thanked Iran for giving early notice, which made it possible for no lives to be lost. Authorities in Qatar say all the missiles were successfully intercepted and there were no casualties.
TW's Benjamin Alvarez-Gruber is in Washington for us. Benjamin, Trump now says that Israel and Iran have agreed to a ceasefire. Bring us up to speed on the latest.
That's right. U.S. President Trump said that and I quote, complete and total ceasefire between Israel and Iran would go into force with the view, of course, to end this 12-day war between both countries. As we're hearing that both sides are still threatening new attacks, this ceasefire, if it holds, that's the important question here, of course, would be welcome news for the region. But the situation in the Middle East still remains far from stable, and it's impossible to predict how longer-term dynamics might actually be affected. And at the same time, we're actually also getting several reports of heavy Israeli airstrikes continuing in Tehran, the capital of Iran, and other cities too. But on this Truth Social post, President Trump appeared to suggest that both Israel and Iran could have some time to complete any missions that are still underway, at which point the ceasefire actually would begin in a staged process. But we're still waiting for more details how this process might look like.
Benjamin, just to be clear, do we even know if Israel and Iran have confirmed the ceasefire yet?
So there's been a rather cryptic post on X, formerly known as Twitter, by the Iranian foreign minister. He says, as Iran has repeatedly made clear, Israel launched war on Iran, not the other way round. He then goes on saying, as of now, there is no agreement on any ceasefire or cessation of military operations. However, provided this Israeli regime stops its illegal aggression against the Iranian people no later than 4 a.m. Tehran time, we have no intention to continue our response afterwards. But the Iranian foreign minister also leaves it open, says that a decision on cessation of military operations will be made later. There have, of course, been several officials that have talked to U.S. media, but it's important to be very cautious here by what are media reports, by what President Trump is, of course, trying to sell, that this is a deal, and see what will happen in the next couple of hours. We're still getting reports of some Israeli airstrikes happening in Iran right now.
All right, that's DW's Benjamin Alvarez-Gruber in Washington. Thank you. Let's go now to Christopher Preble. He's a senior fellow and director of the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy Program at the Stimson Center. He joins us from Washington. Christopher, welcome. I have to ask you before we get into the strategy aspects of this. First, do you think the ceasefire, as announced, if it's truly taking place, is it durable?
Well, we certainly hope so. The president has a tendency to announce these things, and then we see how people react. As your correspondent noted, the Iranians had responded on X. And of course, the ceasefire wasn't scheduled to take place for a few more hours, so the Israeli strikes seem to be continuing right up until the time when President Trump announced that the ceasefire would take effect. So is it durable? Well, as with any ceasefire, I guess we'll find out if it holds after it is supposed to come into effect.
And this announcement of a ceasefire comes so soon after the U.S. bombing took place. Some analysts, meanwhile, were saying it would take days to even assess the damage and success of the bunker bombing attacks that the U.S. performed. Can we say to what extent the U.S. was interested in inflicting a specific level of destruction on this nuclear capability of Iran, and to what extent this was maybe about sending a message?
Well, I think you're right that we're not going to know the extent of the damage for some time, maybe ever. A lot of this, the damage that was done needs to be inspected. And of course, IAEA inspectors, International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors, typically would do this, but they have less access to these sites than they once had. This is the question about this strike and others like it. What happens to the material that was already produced? Where has that gone? How quickly could the enrichment facilities be brought back online if the Iranians chose to do so? Would they do so in a more clandestine way, a better hidden, better, more resistant to attacks in the future? We just don't know.
Can we say whether the U.S. has made an effective strategic point here, that it will not hold back from intervening militarily?
I think that the combination of the Israeli strikes, which were initiated, remember, when the Trump administration was actively engaged in diplomacy with Iran, those strikes appeared to have sort of knocked the Trump administration away or pushed them away from the diplomatic option. President Trump saw an opportunity to sort of follow on with the Israeli strikes and use U.S. military assets in a very particular way. So clearly it sent a message. Clearly it did some damage. How much so, we'll never know. To me, the unknown question is, what might diplomacy have achieved if it had been allowed to run its course? Might it have been more durable, more enforceable, and, to your earlier point, better monitored by the people who typically monitor these kinds of agreements, like the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that the Obama administration negotiated back in 2015?
We know that things aren't over yet, right? This is still an ongoing situation. But from what we've seen so far, what does it add to our understanding of Trump's foreign affairs instincts, his strategy?
Well, the president certainly likes to win. He likes to be able to point to a success. These kinds of operations lend themselves to declaring victory quickly. The long-term ramifications we may not know for some time. And so this is the part that we are all just sort of waiting for it to spell out. The announcement of a ceasefire and the possibility that might hold certainly would, if it holds and the escalation cycle is broken, that would be good news, again, in the near term. But I think the president wants to be able to call this a victory and move on to other things.
All right, that's Christopher Preble at the Stimson Center. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
DW's Misha Komadovsky in Washington is following the story for us. Misha, Trump says that Israel and Iran have both agreed to the ceasefire. Bring us up to speed on the latest.
Well, President Trump has indeed announced a ceasefire between Israel and Iran. He says both sides have agreed to stop fighting in about 6 hours once they finish their final military operations. Let's take a look at the post itself. According to the president, the ceasefire will last 12 hours, and after that, the war will be officially over. As we see, President Trump is praising the two countries for what he calls their stamina, courage, and intelligence in ending what he's calling the 12-day war, a new term here. And he said this conflict could have lasted for years and spread across the Middle East, but now he says it will not. Last 2 weeks were full of surprises. Indeed, it started with Israel striking Iran, then President Trump trying to stop them, only to later join in on the bombing campaign himself. He hinted at the possible regime change in Iran, even as his vice president insisted that that wasn't the goal. And now a ceasefire. What a turn of events here. He has gone from demanding unconditional surrender to now saying, God bless Israel, God bless Iran, God bless the Middle East. In another post, Donald Trump said, congratulations for the peace, congratulations, award. And amid the fast-moving developments, President Trump is now expected to travel to the NATO summit in the Netherlands. Just days ago, his plans were unclear, especially after his abrupt exit from the G7 summit. But for now, he's expected to go.
Misha, we also see the U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance says that Iran now has no more nuclear capability. First of all, is that something we can even confirm? Do we even know if it's possible to assess that right now? And if so, what does it tell us about where this is going from here, even that assessment from J.D. Vance?
Well, let's look at the wording here. President Trump said the strikes completely and totally obliterated Iran's nuclear sites. Pentagon officials reported extremely severe damage, especially at Fordow. But new intel suggests Iran may have moved enriched uranium beforehand. So the full impact remains unclear, but it may take some time to fully understand the true extent of the damage.
Misha, briefly, this wasn't exactly a fight that Trump's base in the United States wanted, was it?
No, it wasn't. President Trump basically ran on promises to end foreign wars, and that could impact his approval ratings. Even before the U.S. strikes on Iran, a YouGov poll showed just 41% approved of his performance, while 53% did not. We've seen mixed reactions to this military operation within the MAGA movement. Republican leaders in Congress supported the strikes, but some prominent Trump allies called them a mistake. And I was inside the Oval Office when President Trump raised his voice at Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, saying he was playing with World War III. And now that very warning was used against him. And with this ceasefire announcement, Trump may try to return to the kind of rhetoric that helped bring him back to the White House for the second term.
All right, DW's Misha Komadovsky in Washington. Thank you very much. Jonathan Panikoff is the director of the Scowcroft Institute for Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council. Jonathan, welcome to our show. Do you believe that this conflict is over or ending? How should we look at this?
Well, good evening. Thanks for having me. Look, I think it's certainly possible that it is, given the president's confidence, and there seems to be some corroboration on the Iranian side. I think ultimately we saw the Iranians messaging that this is where they wanted to get to. I think the retaliation that they undertook today was clearly designed to provide an off-ramp. And it makes sense for the Iranians, given the challenge that they're currently facing. Their, frankly, malign influence in their region, their power projections has all been sufficiently diminished and significantly diminished by Israel and by the U.S. It's traditionally been a triad, its nuclear program, its ballistic missile program, and its proxies. All three of those are severely weakened. And so I wouldn't be surprised that Iran really is ready for a ceasefire.
What about the U.S.? How interested was it in an off-ramp? We just heard Misha talking about President Trump's base and its disbelief at some of these actions. We also heard President J.D. Vance, Vice President J.D. Vance, saying that capability is in tatters, that nuclear capability, whereas many experts seem to suggest that it's too early to say. Are both sides here looking for an off-ramp and not just Iran?
I think the U.S. certainly was not inclined to get further involved. I think President Trump was pretty clear he wanted this to be a one-off. It was going to be up to Iran and how it retaliated to determine whether that was true. It did so narrowly in a way that allowed, I think, President Trump to frankly dismiss it and be able to say there's no reason to respond again to Iran. But I think it's also true. Look, politically, this has split the MAGA base here in Washington. It's really upset a number of folks who wanted the U.S. not to get involved at all. On the other hand, I think it's probably given Trump some credibility with not only regional partners, but also across the globe. I think Russia, China, also have to pause now and say, okay, under what circumstances is the U.S. really willing to commit military force, even if it's limited and scoped narrowly?
What about Israel? Of course, it's the other major player in this conflict. it has a say as well. Is it also assured that this is the appropriate off-ramp that it wants?
I don't know if Israel is as assured. Look, I think you were right in your previous question. I think it's very unclear where we are in terms of Iran's nuclear program. I've got no doubt that the B-2s hit their targets at Fordo and that they did so successfully. But there's a real question about whether or not the Iranians were able to get a lot of the highly enriched uranium moved out of Fordo ahead of time. If that's the case, then there's really a pathway here, a more narrow one, but nevertheless a significant pathway here the Israelis are going to have to worry about. They had two main objectives. One was to destroy Iran's nuclear program and to destroy Iran's ballistic missile capabilities. It has certainly set back the ballistic missile capabilities, and it has certainly set back Iran's nuclear program, so that it's certainly not an existential threat in terms of the timeline that Israel was worried about. But there is still a real concern here that if Iran has that highly enriched uranium, if it does have secret sites somewhere in the country, and you combine that with its ability to still have some centrifuges and to spin it in the machine, then it doesn't mean Iran's nuclear program is over, even though it's been significantly set back.
Jonathan, briefly, we know that Iran's been significantly weakened and was looking for an off-ramp, as you've suggested. We also know that the nuclear program has been massively important for this regime. Can it really afford to let it just lie in ruins?
It's going to be a debate, I think, internally. Look, Iran's not a monolith. The supreme leader has ultimate control and final say, but there will be hardliners who say, no, we need to take what remains of the nuclear program and try to reestablish it. And I think there will be some more pragmatic folks who say, absolutely not. Iran has invested roughly $500 billion in the nuclear program if you combine both the actual infrastructure as well as revenue lost from sanctions on the program. Having the ability to reinvest all of that again would be very, very difficult or even a big part of it. And so it's going to be a debate. But I think what's true is the balance of power in the region has shifted immensely away from Iran. And I think Iran's going to have to struggle through and figure out how does it go forward across its regional power projections, not just the nuclear power, but the potential for its ballistic missile programs and proxies. What does it do in terms of reinvestment in any of those? Does it even try?
All right, that's Jonathan Panikoff at the Atlantic Council. Thank you so much.
Thank you.